The best thing about building a 300 SL Gullwing recreation is the fact there is no build manual. There are no how-to guides. No one is telling you right from wrong. The worst thing about building one of these are those exact same points. It's not until you dive into one aspect of work, actually get it complete, stand back to appraise, could you really appreciate whether you could have done something better. And in this episode, this is my absolute case in point, because I finish up the rear support structure. I then dive straight into the mounting points necessary to get the boot lid mounted before actually mounting the boot lid, the first body panel on the car. Have I done it the right way? Who knows, but I'm really pleased to be sharing this whole journey with you. So the last week or so, I have been putting in hours and hours into making what I would probably describe as the secondary support frame. So what I mean by that is there's the primary, which is the boot or the trunk floor. There's the roll cage, the door bars. Now, what I've gotten into is actually making the support structure that cloaks the inside of the body to give the actual bodywork its support. This is sort of the more intricate framework that really starts to give that skeleton support to the inside of the body. So, like I say, I've been working away behind the scenes because I wasn't sure in the first instance how this was going to pan out, if I'm perfectly honest. And also it was a heck of a lot of time on the tube roller, then followed by cut a bit, trim a bit, roll a bit more, pull a bit here, etc, etc. So in terms of video, you know, it's sort of things you've seen me do before. So what I want to do is take the time to get you caught up on everything that has gone on, because there has been a really good amount of progress. So I'm pleased to share that with you. And then we're going to be getting on to slightly more interesting new work. And I'm looking at making the support for the boot lid hinges. And so I can actually get the framework for the boot lid mounted to the car. So, you know, it's really starting to get progress going in the right direction, and yeah, just sharing this whole journey with you. So let's get you caught up with what has been going on. Diving straight into the back of the car, what you can start to see here are the vertical support bars that I have bent up. They're made out of the same 25 millimeter diameter 3mm wall thickness tube that I've been using everywhere else. So you can see the horizontal bars there, and if I try and pan down and pan up, you can actually see the swept bar that runs right from the back corner of the chassis, and that picks up the roll bar that runs along the back edge of the car. So that will weld down there fully, and then that flies all the way through, picking up the underside of the body all the way through to the B pillar of the roll cage. Now, if we dive into the front there, now I've described before that triangles are strong in their inherent shape. So what I wanted to do, instead of making, now you'll be able to get the gist of how this is all panning out. You can see the couple of spot welds here of where the tube lands, and you can imagine that that runs all the way through on the peak of the body. You can see where I had picked up and used the clecos just to hold it into place. So that runs along the whole high point of the rear quarter, and like I say, comes through at this point here. So what I've used, instead of picking up a single tube here and a single tube here and making it slightly messy looking, I've made this gusset plate out of 3mm mild steel, which is the same as the roll cage landing points, and then just made up a really nice sort of cardboard templated shape before transferring that through onto this metal and getting this tack welded into place. And you can see, looking over at the other side of the car, how that bar on the underside of the rear quarter sort of swoops down and then picks up the boot floor at the back, and that is actually landing in between the actual boot opening and the rear light assembly. you can see there, and I'll show you on this side, you can see there that I've got the original rear light housings, and these fit in with sufficient clearance necessary. If I can just show you one-handed. So all of this was being taken into account when I was bending up this hoop. And as you can imagine, it took a horrible amount of time, but it was worth it in the end. And looking from the back side, you can see, if I can lean up and through the car, you can see where that tube lands onto the gusset plate, just there, and just tack welded into place, just temporarily, until the body comes off, and then it can be fully seam welded out. I have started mucking around, folding up some temporary brackets of where I'm going to position the boot lid hinges, the trunk hinges, and this is the next portion of work that I want to get into. And I'm going to bring you along for the ride on this one, because it is something new and different rather than the usual rolling tube, trimming tube, etc. So let's dive into that, and I will pick up where we have got to so far. So what I've got behind me is the actual boot lid structure, because as you know, if you've seen the previous videos, all of these body parts come with an inner and an outer skin. So I'm obviously going to be working on getting the inner skin mounted before bonding the top skin onto it, you know, much further down the road. So I've already spent quite a bit of time just figuring out where I want the actual hinge to be situated, which I've got here, and then drilled a couple of pilot holes so I can get the hinges held on with a couple of clecos. What I wanted to show you in the first instance are the boot lid hinges, the trunk hinges, whatever you want to call them. Now, these are patterns of the existing hinges. Now, if you have an original gull wing, then these would bolt straight into your car. Because we are dealing with a recreation and we obviously don't have the same mounting points in the actual body itself, then for me, I found that these hinges need some modification, and it'll all make sense when I get this into the car, you know, and show you where we are in the whole process of this. What you can see is I've had to put in a slice into this portion of the hinge. So this is the piece that mounts into the car. And then this is where the actual trunk sits, the actual boot sits and lifts up and down. So I've had to change the angle of this. I've had to lessen the angle. Yeah, it would be. It'd be making the angle shallower. So this portion here, which fits to the underside of the trunk, sits beautifully parallel. The quality of these, yes, they're all right, but they do need quite a lot of refinishing. So for me to cut these up, I really wasn't too fussed. You know, these are only aerosol painted by the look of it. So I'm going to spend a lot more time getting these prepped to a far nicer state before I then either have them chromed or I use a chrome powder coat, which I can do here because I've built myself a powder coating oven quite some time ago. Let me get this fitted into the car, and then you can see what I've had to sort of deal with, alter and tweak to, you know, start getting everything working together in the right sort of direction to actually get this working. With the hinge roughly in position, you can sort of see where I'm going with all of this. The reason for the cut in the hinge to open up that angle so it mounted parallel to the actual framework of the trunk or the boot, and then the temporary bracket into place, basically pushing the pivot point of the hinge as tight to the underside of the body as possible. It means that the motion when you first open the boot lid is very much more in an upwards direction. If this pivot point was way down here somewhere, when you went to open the boot lid, it would be more of a backwards sweep in its radius, and it would actually foul the body of the car. Ask me how I know. So now I've got the principle set, I can use this bracketry as a template and come up with something far nicer looking, because like I say, this was just a temporary, just to get the theory, get the practice into position, into place. So now I can come up with the final design and start to get this tacked into position, re-weld the hinges, get those finished out a bit nicer, and then yeah, just sort of keep pushing ahead. The temporary hinge brackets I made out of 1.2mm mild steel, which is the same stuff that I used for the boot floor. Now, if you think about the forces that are on these hinges in relation to the size of this bracket, it's minimal. So I am making the final versions of these brackets out of the same material. One thing I do want to do is just add a gusset plate just to triangulate it, because there is still a very small amount of flex on this longer length, even when it is welded into the car. And I want to make sure that this remains completely solid, so all of my body gap tolerances remain exactly as I set them. So what I did was, as always, cardboard template, and made myself up the shape of the gusset plate that I needed. This radius here is where this bracket mounts in relation to the roll cage. So once I had that, cut it out of some mild steel, and here you can see one of the final mounts just tack welded into position. So this actual gusset plate here will mount on the outside of the roll cage hoop, if that makes sense. So inside of the car, you would, if you looked hard enough, took away enough panels, you would actually see this face here. Now, the reason I haven't made it completely infilled on both faces is because I'm still planning on using a separate nut and bolt system. When I cut the holes for the hinge mounts, I'm probably going to elongate these holes to allow me some movement of the actual hinge forwards and backwards, depending how big I make these holes, possibly even side to side. So I'm not planning on welding a captive nut on the underside, so I still need access for a spanner, socket, whatever, to be able to tighten that nut on the underside. So that is the reason that this is only a partial gusset that you can see here. But again, it'll all get welded in to that roll cage radius as it then flies off up to the B-pillar. I've not tried this one in the car just yet, but one I have tried, I have fully welded and dressed, and this is all set to be set back in the car for one last time, so I can then get some spot welds on it and get it fixed into place and make it a permanent fixture on the car. So that's exactly what I did, getting the bracket over to the car and then using my digital angle finder just to get it situated into position, both in the X and the Y axis, or however you want to look at it, you know, making sure that it was perfectly vertical and also square and true to the rest of the roll cage. So once I was happy with that, then just put on a couple of dabs of weld just to hold it in position. I then jumped back over to the workbench and finished finally welding out the second bracket before then dressing all the welds down and then hitting it with a DA to give it that final finish. Then jumping back over to the car for one last time to carry out that same setting out before popping on a couple of tack welds to get that second one in position. And here you can see me just offering the hinge into place, followed by the actual boot frame, just to start getting everything fixed into place. So I've mucked around off of camera for quite a decent chunk of time, just getting the boot frame into position. I took some time to adjust the actual hinges where it mounts to the roll cage. I did put in a slotted hole into the new mount, so that then allows me to move the hinge assembly itself forwards and backwards, and then teaming up with mucking around with the Cleco pin locations also, I've just started to really finalize the position of this framework. So next thing I want to do is just temporarily put some bolts through the frame into the hinges. So that is then going to lock everything into place, because there is still a small amount of play using these Cleco pins. From there, I need to look at the curvature of the actual framework, because it doesn't follow the rear quarter quite as nicely as I need it to. So I'll put in some packers along the return edge of the body, and if the frame falls into shape, then absolutely perfect. If not, I'll just need to put some relief cuts into the frame to then allow it to droop down and follow the curvature of that rear quarter. That'll then pull in this slight overhang that I've got on the bottom edge of the boot where it meets the rear valance. So, you know, it's going to cure a couple of small issues with one sort of chunk of work. So that'll be good to get done. And then from there, I can start looking at the outer skin, just getting it clecoed into place really, just so it starts to shape up nicely. So yeah, that's where we are. The boot is, you know, opens and closes exactly as I would hope for. Along this top edge here, I've got maybe a 3 or 4 mil panel gap, which is, you know, for me, I'm more than happy with that. I can obviously fine tune that when the outer skin does come into play. So as it stands, you know, the first outer body panel is in position and it's shaping up well. So let's keep on with the momentum and get on to the next stage of work. Fitting the outer skin just felt like a real nice milestone. Knowing that I'm in that position with this boot installation to get that skin on just to start the final test fit, it just felt like a really good stage of work to get to. I've just held it into position at the moment with a few clecos, certainly sufficient enough for this point of the exercise. What I then did do was jump up into the loft space and dig out the boot lid seal, because I know that will affect the fitment of the boot frame, and it is critical that you take everything into account when you're doing work of this nature. So just with a few pieces of double-sided tape, I just wanted to temporarily put that seal into place so I could continue to finesse the fitment. I've previously mentioned that when you're trying to fit boots and bonnets and doors, whatever it may be, the critical importance of having all of the seals and gaskets available to you so you can mock them up along with the mock-up of those body parts, because the thickness of a gasket or a seal really does affect the fit and finish by a huge amount. And this boot is a perfect example. If you remember a few moments ago in a previous segment, I'd mentioned that the framework of the boot hadn't taken the line of the rear quarter panel. And I'd mentioned that there may be the possibility of needing to put some slices in the frame to allow it to droop to take the form of that rear quarter. But by just fitting this seal, and yes, I have got a pair of mole grips holding down the frame to emulate a boot lock, for example. This has now taken the line of that rear quarter absolutely perfectly, both sides. If I hadn't fitted this seal, if I hadn't had it to hand, I may have gone through some invasive work to this frame that wasn't strictly necessary. So it just goes to show that you need as many parts as possible to hand to help you when the time comes to build one of these things as best as possible. Right, we jump ahead somewhat into a new portion of work, and I'm going to cover this off quite quickly. But what you can see me doing here is rolling a new piece of bar, and this is going to provide support in between the backside of the boot lid and the bottom of the windscreen, the portion of body that wraps around the bottom there. There was some movement in it, so I knew it was important to get a portion of secondary structure tight up against that body to take out any flex, and then that will of course help me continue to fit the boot lid because there's not that movement in the body. And as I've mentioned before, this tube roller is absolutely fantastic. The gradual seamless bends it gives, it's absolutely worth its weight in gold when it comes to work of this nature. I've started to trim down the length of the tube and get it offered into place. And here you can see it just sort of wedged into position. Now, what I need to do is continue to do some additional bending because I'm trying to get this so you can actually see it. The contour of the tube, now it's in place, isn't quite tight enough to follow the nice even radius around that back edge of the screen. And also on this leg here, I obviously want the tube to land on this roll cage hoop. You can see it's just flying in over the top. So I need to bring the curvature round further still so I can then get it landing where I need to. But here, hopefully you can sort of make out the principle of what I'm going to do. And then, like I've mentioned, there'll be a central leg that comes and mounts down to the chassis there to stop any flex along that midpoint of the bar. So I'm going to continue doing some bending and trimming and bits and pieces. And this is basically where the time-consuming work comes in. It's just trial and error, just sneaking up on that fit so you don't go too far and, you know, ruin the piece or have to take some of the curve out of the bar, because that can be a pain in the backside, although not insurmountable. So let me crack on with this and I will check back in with you in what will feel like a few seconds time. Again, hopping around a little bit, once I'd got that bar into place, it dawned on me that that central stanchion, that central brace that I had spoken about putting in, was very probably going to foul the interior trim that forms the entire backside of the interior of the car. And because that was so important for me to keep this detail, I wanted to get that fitted as best as possible at the moment, just to see if I had to revise my initial idea of having that single stanchion and try and come up with an alternative design. So here you can see me just taking my time, trimming it down. It looks drastic, but this is all going to be reformed. It'll all need to be reformed around the B and the C pillars where the roll cage is now situated. So it's just part and parcel of this work. Looks drastic, but it really isn't in the grand scheme of things. So once I'd got the rear trim cut up and into position, it was very clear that that single stanchion bar that I spoke about, that was going to sit roughly about there, was never going to work with the shape of this trim itself. So this was one piece that I really wanted to keep correct and true. The height of the floor that runs through the backside of the cabin and that detail around the rear bulkhead. Because I want to run the original look luggage in its size and its depth and its height, I want to make sure that the rear floor of this car is as per the original, and using this as the datum and having that detail along that rear bulkhead was very, very important. So what I did do, and coming round to the back, so doing away with that single stanchion, I have introduced two diagonal braces that weld onto the roll cage and then pick up on the curved hoop that runs around the back of this rear scuttle. I don't know what you want to call it. But this is a super simple way of doing it. And like I've said before, you know, if it looks right, then it is right. And this feels very, you know, correct to me. It picks up the tube at some really nice even spacings and has firmed up this rear portion of the body absolutely perfectly. The body is going to be bonded to the metal structure, so that's going to provide the physical bond between the two. But this, along with the boot lid hinges, it's all just coming together really quite nicely. And then of course, what we've also built in this video is that secondary structure that runs around the backside of the rear quarters also. So there has been a heck of a lot of work that has gone on in this episode. So I think this video really does go to show, you know, the grind that goes into building one of these. The secondary frame structure, it wasn't glamorous, it was time consuming and tedious, but it was incredibly necessary in getting this back end of the car framed out. Then moving on to the hinges, I'm really quite pleased with the simplicity of the hinge bracketry that I came up with and getting the hinges mounted, because getting the boot lid on here, even just clecoed into position, it feels like a huge milestone. Now, you know, you're fitting body panels is a huge thing, and it feels like a big step in the right direction. Also coming up with the workaround for the support around the backside of the body when I figured out that I couldn't use that single stanchion that I previously touched on, and coming up with that triangulated design here in the back, I think has worked out basically better than I could ever imagine, really. This has been one of those videos that, yeah, it's not big bells and whistles, there's not huge big milestones, it's just that continual progression, just ticking off of those jobs and just working my way through what I need to get through. And that is the fabrication of this primary and secondary structure. I don't think I can delay it any longer. The next video is going to have to be the fabrication of the A-pillar hoop. That is now holding me up doing anything further forwards in the car. I need that to be able to then fabricate the spine that runs along the actual roof, so then I can fabricate up the hinge mounts necessary to get the doors hung, and then obviously working forwards towards the front of the car from there. So yeah, that is going to be the next one, I think. But up until that point, I'll catch you next time.